All right, you degenerate gamblers, strap yourselves in, because today we're going deep on the clusterfuck that is early NFL history.
I can't wait.
Yeah, so you wanted to know about championships before the Super Bowl even existed.
It's a crazy story.
Let's just say it's a wild fucking ride.
The NFL we all know and love today, man.
Yeah.
It's a far cry from the early days.
It really is.
Humble beginnings, sometimes downright shady.
That's for sure.
We're talking disputed titles, rule changes that'll make your head spin.
Yeah.
Games played on dirt fields, indoors.
Indoors.
Yeah.
Can't make this shit up.
So we've got a mountain of sources here, right? Old articles, dusty rule books, Wikipedia rabbit holes.
Oh, yeah.
We're going all the way back to the 1920s. The Wild West of the NFL.
Absolutely.
So paint us a picture. What the hell is going on back then?
Well, the first thing you got to understand is that before 1933, there wasn't even a championship game.
What?
The team with the best record at the end of the season was just declared the champ. Hold on, so you're telling me they didn't even have a playoff system? What kind of bullshit is that?
It was a different time.
I guess.
Just picture this. The Akron Pros win the first ever NFL title in 1920, even though they had 3 ties on their record. Now, by today's rules, ties count towards your win percentage, right?
Right.
But back then, they didn't give a shit. So the Buffalo All-Americans, who had more wins but also more losses, got totally screwed.
Damn, those poor bastards. They got robbed.
Exactly. It gets even juicier.
Oh, lay on me.
You know George Halas, the legendary coach of the Chicago Bears?
Of course. Papa Bear himself.
Back then, his team was called the Chicago Staleys.
Right, the Staleys.
Well, in 1921 and 1924, Halas tried to manipulate the system
Oh, really?
by scheduling tough opponents early in the season when his team was stronger,
Okay.
and then stacking the end of the season with weaker teams to boost their winning percentage.
That sneaky son of a bitch. You got to admire the hustle, though.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of shady tactics, let's talk about the 1925 Pottsville Maroons scandal.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
The Maroons were a powerhouse team.
They were.
But they got suspended for playing an unsanctioned game against a team from another league.
Oh, right, right.
As punishment, the NFL stripped them of their title and offered it to the Chicago Cardinals, who, get this, actually declined.
Wait, they said no to a goddamn championship. What the hell were they thinking?
Nobody knows for sure, but some say they felt it was tainted and didn't want to win that way.
Oh.
Talk about taking the high road, right?
But more like missing out on a chance to rub it in their rivals' faces.
Right.
But this whole best record wins thing, man, it must have led to some seriously pissed off teams and fans back then.
Oh, you can bet your ass it did. Just imagine the arguments and conspiracy theories flying around.
Oh, I can only imagine.
And to make matters worse, if they'd used different criteria, like win-loss differential, a whole bunch of those early championships would have gone to different teams.
Win-loss differential.
Yeah.
For those of us who didn't spend our childhoods memorizing football stats, what the hell is that?
Right. Basically, the difference between the total points your team scores and the total points your opponents score. So a team could have a slightly worse record, but still be considered better because they dominated their opponents with a larger margin. Makes sense, right?
That actually seems like a fairer way to do it. It's less judging a fighter by how badly they beat their opponents, not just how many fights they win.
Exactly. But in those early days, the NFL was still figuring things out. You know, it was a wild, chaotic time, and it led to some truly bizarre moments in football history.
Speaking of bizarre, didn't you say something about a championship game played on a dirt field?
Oh, yeah, that was in 1932. The Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans finished the season tied. So they had to have a playoff game to decide the championship. But get this, there was a massive snowstorm, so they ended up playing the game indoors on a modified baseball field with a dirt infield.
Hold the fucking phone. A professional football game.
I know.
Played indoors on dirt. These guys were hardcore. No wonder they were always breaking bones.
I know, right? That game was a turning point for the league, though.
Was it?
Yeah. They realized they needed clearer rules and a more formal way to determine a champion.
Okay, so what happened? What came out of this whole debacle?
Well, it also led to some important rule changes that we still see today.
Like what? Don't leave us hanging.
Well, before that game, the goalposts were actually on the goal line. Can you imagine trying to kick a field goal with a bunch of massive dudes standing right in front of the goal?
Sounds like a recipe for a broken neck.
Exactly. So they moved the goalposts back to the end line, which is where they are today.
Thank God.
Right. And they also changed the rules for forward passes, allowing quarterbacks to throw the ball from anywhere behind the line of scrimmage instead of just 5 yards back.
So this dirt field fiasco actually revolutionized the game. Who knew?
Sometimes the biggest changes come from the most unexpected places. That's the beauty of NFL history.
We survived the Wild West era. I need a goddamn drink after all that chaos.
I hear you.
But before we move on to the next chapter, let me ask you this.
Sure.
Do you think the NFL would be what it is today without all this early bullshit?
That's a great question. It's hard to say for sure, but I think those early controversies and rule changes forced the league to evolve and become more organized. You know?
So basically they had to learn from their fuck-ups.
Exactly.
Sounds familiar.
And as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, the NFL's journey is far from over. There are more rival leagues, more rule changes, and of course, the eventual rise of the Super Bowl.
All right, you heard the man. Buckle up, buttercups, because we're just getting started.
Yeah.
All right, so we've crawled out of the primordial ooze of early NFL history.
Yeah.
Now we're moving into the era where the league started to get its shit together, at least somewhat.
You're talking about the period from 1933 to 1965.
Okay.
When the NFL finally decided to have an actual championship game.
Makes sense.
They also divided the teams into divisions and later conferences.
So they finally stopped crowning champions based on who had the least fucked up record.
Pretty much.
I see.
They were starting to realize that a championship game would generate more excitement, more revenue.
There's the NFL we know and love.
No.
Always chasing that almighty dollar.
But even with a championship game, they still managed to make things complicated.
How so?
Remember that ridiculous alternating home field advantage rule we talked about?
I do. What about it?
Well, for some reason, they decided to keep that for the championship game.
Wait, so the team with the better record didn't always get to host the championship?
What the fuck?
Yep. It was based on which division you were in, regardless of your actual performance.
That's so stupid.
Prime example is the 1965 NFL championship game between the Green Bay Packers and the Baltimore Colts.
Okay.
The Packers had a better record. Had already beaten the Colts twice during the regular season, but guess what? They had to play in Baltimore.
Bingo.
You're kidding me.
And the Colts ended up winning in overtime. Can you imagine the uproar if that happened today?
Social media would explode.
Ow.
Heads would roll. It would be glorious chaos. But hey, at least they finally got rid of those tie games, right?
Well, not so fast. They introduced sudden death overtime for playoff games in 1946, but regular season games could still end in a tie.
Oh, come on.
It wasn't until 1974 that they finally brought overtime to the regular season.
So for decades, they were just cool with games ending in a big fat... Talk about anticlimactic.
Yeah, but you gotta remember, the NFL was still figuring things out, and they had bigger problems to worry about, like the emergence of rival leagues.
Oh yeah, those pesky upstarts trying to steal the NFL's thunder. Tell me more about that.
Well, the first one was the All-America Football Conference.
Okay.
Or AAFC.
The AFC, all right.
It started in 1944.
Okay.
They had one team that was absolutely dominant, the Cleveland Browns.
Hold on. The Browns.
I know.
Dominant. Are we talking about the same Cleveland Browns that haven't won a championship since the Stone Age?
I know, right? It's hard to believe, but back then, they were a force to be reckoned with. They even had a perfect season in 1948, winning all their games.
Really? A perfect season?
Yeah. But the problem is the NFL doesn't recognize those championships because, well, it wasn't their lead.
Typical NFL bullshit. Those guys are masters at rewriting history to make themselves look good.
But the AAFC eventually folded, and most of their teams were absorbed into the NFL, including the Browns. But then, in 1960, another rival league emerged, the American Football League.
Ah, the AFL. Now, those guys were serious competition.
Absolutely. The AFL was all about high-scoring offenses, flashy players, and exciting games. They were like the rebellious younger brother to the NFL's stuffy older brother.
And just like any good sibling rivalry, things got pretty heated.
You could say that. They were competing for fans, for television deals, and most importantly, for players.
Right.
And it was actually this competition that ultimately led to the merger of the two leagues in 1966.
So the fear of losing players and money forced the NFL to play nice. Ironic, isn't it?
Very ironic.
I love it.
But before we get to the merger and the birth of the Super Bowl, we need to talk about the 4 Super Bowl precursor games.
Wait, there were pre-Super Bowls. This is getting good.
Yep. They were called the AFL-NFL World Championship Games. And they were basically a best-of-5 series to determine which league was truly the best.
So who won? Don't leave us hanging.
It was a tie. The NFL won 2 games and the AFL won 2 games. Talk about setting the stage for an epic merger.
Holy shit, this whole thing is like a soap opera with rival families, backstabbing, and a whole lot of money at stake.
That's a pretty accurate description. But the merger changed everything. It created the NFL we know today with conferences, divisions, expanded playoffs, and of course, the Super Bowl. But that's a story for the next part of our deep dive.
All right, you've got me hooked. Let's take a quick break to refill our drinks and prepare for the grand finale. We're about to enter the modern era of the NFL. And trust me, it's a wild ride.
So here we are at the dawn of the Super Bowl era.
1970, baby.
The NFL and AFL officially merged.
Finally.
Creating the behemoth we know and love.
Or hate.
Depending on your level of cynicism.
Let's be real. The NFL is like that you can't quit.
Oh, yeah.
Even though you know they're bad for you.
I hear ya.
You keep coming back for more, hoping this time it'll be different.
I get it. Well, the merger certainly brought a lot of changes.
Such as?
We have this new conference and division structure.
Makes sense.
An expanded playoff format.
Right?
And of course, the Super Bowl, which quickly became the biggest sporting event in America.
Speaking of playoffs, didn't you say they kept that bullshit home field advantage rule even after the merger?
Yeah, for some reason they stuck with that until 1975.
So even with the Super Bowl on the line, the best team didn't always get to play at home. That's some serious bullshit.
It led to some pretty unfair matchups.
Squat.
Like in 1972, the Miami Dolphins went undefeated the entire season.
The perfect season.
A feat no other team has ever accomplished. But in the AFC Championship game, they had to play on the road against the Pittsburgh Steelers.
The Steel Curtain.
Who were also undefeated.
So the Dolphins, who were literally perfect, had to play in enemy territory. That's fucked up.
And the Steelers almost pulled off the upset, too.
No way.
They held a lead going into the fourth quarter.
Really?
But the Dolphins ultimately won and went on to win the Super Bowl, completing their perfect season.
That's a hell of a story.
It is.
But I bet those Dolphins players were still pissed off about having to play that game on the road.
Oh, I'm sure they were. But, hey, at least they won. And eventually, the NFL came to its senses and started using seeding to determine home field advantage in the playoffs.
Thank God for small miracles. Speaking of coming to their senses, they finally got rid of those tie games in the regular season, right?
Well, it took them a while. They actually started counting ties toward winning percentage in 1972.
Okay.
But they didn't introduce overtime for regular season games until 1974.
Can you believe that?
Yeah.
For decades, they just let those games end in a draw.
Mm-hmm.
That's like going to a rock concert and the band just walks off stage halfway through the set.
It's definitely not the most satisfying way to end a game.
No kidding.
But the NFL was still trying to find the right balance between competition and player safety.
I guess I can see that.
Overtime in every regular season game could lead to more injuries, especially late in the season.
Yeah, that makes sense. But let's move on to something a little more exciting. Franchise dominance.
Hooray.
We've talked about how the NFL evolved over time.
Yes.
But who are the teams that consistently kicked ass and took home the championship hardware?
Well, you can't talk about NFL dominance without mentioning the Green Bay Packers.
Those cheeseheads have been a dynasty since the leather helmet days.
13 championships in total.
Wow.
9 before the Super Bowl era.
Yeah.
And 4 after.
Including
the first 2 Super Bowls ever played.
That's right.
They were led by legendary coach Vince Lombardi.
The man, the myth, the legend.
Who basically wrote the book on winning in the NFL.
And speaking of legends, the Chicago Bears and New York Giants aren't too far behind with 9 and 8 championships respectively. But there's one team with a pretty controversial claim to fame.
Oh, yeah.
The Cleveland Browns.
Ah, yes, the Browns?
Tell me more about these guys.
They technically have 8 championships.
Okay.
But the NFL only recognizes 4 of them because the other 4 came from the AAFC, that rival league we talked about earlier.
It's like the NFL is trying to erase those early championships from history.
It is what it is.
Poor Browns fans. No wonder they're always so miserable.
But let's fast forward a bit to the Super Bowl era.
Okay.
One team that has dominated this era is the New England Patriots.
Oof. Don't remind me. As a Jets fan, I still haven't recovered from the Brady-Belichick dynasty.
6 Super Bowl wins.
Yeah, it's sickening.
But it's a testament to their consistency and ability to adapt to the changing game.
Yeah, whatever.
Blech.
Let's move on before I throw up. What about some of the other successful teams?
Well, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Dallas Cowboys are tied for second with 5 Super Bowl wins each. The San Francisco 49ers and the Denver Broncos each have 3.
Makes sense.
And then there are the teams that always seem to come close, but can't quite seal the deal.
You talking about the Buffalo Bills and their 4 consecutive Super Bowl losses? That's got to be some kind of record for heartbreak.
It's definitely up there.
Ouch.
And then you have the Minnesota Vikings, who have made it to the Super Bowl 4 times but never won.
It's like those teams are cursed. Maybe they need to sacrifice a goat or something to appease the football gods.
Maybe. But that's the beauty of the NFL. You never know what's going to happen. One year, you're a cellar dweller, and the next, you're hoisting the Lombardi Trophy.
Right. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
Yeah, we have.
From the Wild West era to the Super Bowl dynasties, we've seen the NFL evolve from a chaotic mess into the multi-billion-dollar spectacle it is today. What's the biggest takeaway for you?
I think it's that the NFL, despite all its flaws and controversies, is a reflection of American culture.
Ooh, that's deep.
It's a story of ambition, competition, innovation, and the constant pursuit of victory, no matter the cost.
That's a pretty deep thought for a guy who spends most of his time analyzing game film and crunching numbers.
Hey, even nerds can have moments of clarity.
Fair enough. Well, I gotta say, this deep dive has been more interesting than I expected. I actually learned a few things, and I'm not even hungover yet.
That's great. And for our listeners who made it through this wild ride with us, we salute you.
We do.
Hopefully you enjoyed this glimpse into the crazy, sometimes unbelievable history of the NFL.
And if not, well, at least you got to hear us rant and rave for an hour. So until next time, keep your helmets on, your beers cold, and your bullshit detectors finely tuned. We're out.